In June 1942, Tobruk fell in just one day, resulting in the capture of 33,000 soldiers. In this episode, you will witness Rommel's wide maneuver around the Gazala line and the determination of the Free French at Bir Hakeim. You will also see how British mistakes turned the battle into the Gazala Gallop. We will uncover the challenges of supply and communication, ranging from Malta's struggles to the warnings of Ultra. This leads us to the chaotic retreat that concludes at El Alamein. Meanwhile, the failure at Dieppe occurs, and Adolf Hitler pushes toward the Caucasus as Stalingrad ignites in flames. As the sandstorm clears, the pivotal right hook south of Gazala begins our story. After the shameful retreat through Cyrenaica in early 1942, the myth of Rommel, vigorously promoted by Joseph Goebbels, was also endorsed by the British. The myth of the Desert Fox was a misguided way for them to rationalize their own failures. Hitler was both amazed and pleased by this adulation. It fed his belief that the British, following their losses in the Far East, were on the verge of collapse. However, he was willing to rein in his favored general to satisfy the Italians. Benito Mussolini faced increasing opposition within the Comando Supremo. Many felt that he was too aligned with Hitler. They were also irritated by Rommel's arrogance and his demands, not to mention his continual complaints about their inability to provide and protect the supply convoys he required. Furthermore, Franz Halder and the OKH were firmly against reinforcing Rommel. They contended that the Suez Canal should only be captured after a move through the Caucasus. The priority of the Eastern Front remained a strong rationale as they prepared for their significant offensive in southern Russia. Only the Kriegsmarine, which advocated for defeating Britain first, backed Rommel's ambitions. The island of Malta faced a dire situation due to a renewed bombing campaign by the Luftwaffe against its airfields and the main harbor of Valletta. In March, every ship in a convoy was destroyed, and both military personnel and civilians were at risk of starvation. However, in May, the delivery of 60 Spitfires from the aircraft carrier USS Wasp, along with supplies brought by a mine layer, rescued the island. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, the German commander-in-chief in the Mediterranean, had planned an airborne invasion of Malta known as Operation Hercules. These plans had to be postponed due to Hitler's doubts about success and the need for resources further east. The Italians also sought excessive support before making any commitments. Rommel disregarded his orders and supply issues once more. He began advancing the Panzer Army Africa toward the Gazala line. An Unteroffizier wrote home in April that the fighting offered none of the horrors or indescribable misery found in the Russian campaign. There were no villages or towns destroyed or laid waste. In another letter that evening, he wrote to his mother about how the British soldiers took everything in a more sporting manner. He was optimistic, declaring, "Onwards to a decisive victory." Rommel's soldiers faced swarms of flies and the intense heat that baked their bread hard, yet they remained hopeful. They anticipated a victory from the great offensive in Russia, imagining that the British would be crushed from both sides. They looked forward to a trip to Cairo. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht began to support Rommel's ambition of capturing Egypt and the Suez Canal. Adolf Hitler grew concerned that American military assistance might arrive sooner than expected. He knew that an Allied attack across the English Channel could not be ruled out. Rommel believed that if he could defeat the Eighth Army, it would shatter British morale. The Japanese had also signaled that they would advance westward into the Indian Ocean only if the Germans secured the Suez Canal. Rommel's first move in his invasion of Egypt, codenamed Operation Theseus, aimed to outflank the British defenses. These defenses extended in fortified positions from Gazala, located 80 kilometers west of Tobruk, down to Bir Hakeim, an outpost defended by General Marie-Pierre Koenig's 1st Free French Brigade. There were 7 fortified positions, each manned by infantry brigade groups equipped with artillery, barbed wire, and minefields connecting to the next box. In the rear, Ritchie had positioned his armored formations for a counterattack. Rommel planned to capture Tobruk, as this port was crucial for resupply. Without it, his Opel Blitz trucks would require 14 days for each round trip to and from Tripoli. Operation Theseus should not have caught the British by surprise, as Bletchley had shared the relevant ultra-decrypts with General Headquarters Middle East. However, the chain of command hesitated to relay this information, only suggesting that an attack was likely in May and could potentially come in the form of a right flank assault from the south. The attack commenced on the 26th of May. Italian infantry divisions advanced on the northern part of the line as a distraction. To the south, the Trieste Motorized Division and the Ariete Armored Division, along with 3 German panzer divisions, moved deep into the desert. A sandstorm hid their 10,000 vehicles from British forces. Later, during the night, Rommel's main force outflanked the Gazala line from the south. Rommel swiftly maneuvered his divisions in a wide arc, utilizing the bright moonlight as the Khamsin winds died down. They were ready to strike before dawn. About 30 kilometers northeast of Bir Hakeim, the 15th Panzer Division engaged with the 4th Armored Brigade. This resulted in heavy losses for the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment and the 8th Hussars. Shortly after, 80 British tanks counterattacked the 21st Panzer Division. The 8th Army had 167 American Grant tanks at this point. These tanks were heavy, tall, and not very agile when firing, but their 75mm guns were significantly more effective than the inadequate 2-pounders on the Crusaders. Meanwhile, on the 27th of May at 6:30 in the morning, the 3rd Indian Motorized Brigade, located southeast of Bir Hakeim, encountered a serious situation. Their commander reported they were up against a whole bloody German armored division, though it was actually the Italian Ariete Division. The Indian troops managed to destroy 52 tanks, but they were soon overwhelmed after losing all their anti-tank guns. Koenig's Free French Brigade, positioned at Bir Hakeim, sensed danger, having heard tank engines in the desert during the night. In the morning, a patrol confirmed that enemy forces had surrounded them, cutting off their supply route. Koenig commanded around 4,000 men, which included a half-brigade of the Foreign Legion, 2 battalions of colonial troops, and Marine infantry. They also had their own artillery support, consisting of 54 French 75mm field guns and Bofors guns. Like other defensive positions, their front line was fortified with minefields and barbed wire. The tanks of the Ariete Division launched a mass attack against them. French gunners took down 32 tanks. Only 6 Italian tanks managed to breach the mines and wire, but French legionnaires eliminated them at close range. Some even climbed onto the Italian tanks and fired through slits and hatches. The attack lacked infantry support, yet the French valiantly repelled every assault. They inflicted heavy casualties and captured 91 soldiers, including a regimental commander. Skirmishes also occurred with the German 90th Light Division. General de Gaulle later expressed pride, stating that it was the first time since June 1940 that French and German forces clashed. To the northeast, the 90th Light Division engaged the 7th Motorized Brigade, forcing the outnumbered British to retreat. The German unit subsequently took control of the headquarters for the 7th Armored Division and several supply dumps. Despite the rapid advancement of the 90th Light Division, Rommel's 2 panzer divisions faced challenges due to counterattacks and heavy artillery fire while moving north toward the airfield at El Adem, which had seen fierce combat the previous year. Rommel's ambitious plan did not unfold as he intended. His forces found themselves in a precarious position between the Gazala line boxes and the rest of the British armor to the west. Rommel had anticipated a swift defeat of the French at Bir Hakeim, yet they continued to hold their ground. He became increasingly anxious, and many of his officers believed the offensive had faltered. His chief of staff even proposed communicating to the high command that the operation had simply been a reconnaissance in force to salvage the Panzer Army Africa's reputation. However, they need not have been concerned. The British once again struggled to concentrate their tanks effectively enough to make an impact. Rommel aimed to advance north to the coastal road and break the British line there to restore his supply route to Tripoli. When fighting intensified on May 28th, chaos erupted in the center of the Gazala line. Rommel's divisions grappled with shortages of fuel and ammunition, Yet he was once again aided by the slow response of British commanders in taking advantage of their significant superiority. Ritchie considered launching a major night attack, but his corps and divisional commanders insisted they needed more time. They believed the Germans were trapped, but Axis forces were creating a passage in the minefield to the west, allowing supplies to begin flowing through. This route posed a significant problem for the 150th Brigade, as their Yorkshire battalions suddenly created complications for Rommel. Meanwhile, at the Wolfschanze in East Prussia, Hitler focused his attention away from North Africa. Nikolaus von Below, the Luftwaffe adjutant, returned from visiting Rommel to find a very troubling situation. On May 27th, Reinhard Heydrich had been attacked in Prague by young Czechs supported by the British Special Operations Executive. He was still alive, but he would succumb to infections from his wounds within a week. Then, on the night of May 30th, the Royal Air Force launched its first 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne. Adolf Hitler was furious, directing most of his anger at Hermann Göring. Starting on May 31st, during the battle that the British called the Cauldron and the Germans called the Sausage Pot, Rommel unleashed his forces against the position of the 150th Brigade. The assault was overwhelming, featuring tanks, artillery, and Stuka bombers. The brigade fought valiantly to the end, earning the admiration of the Germans. However, the ongoing failure of British commanders to launch a strong counterattack from the west marked one of the least impressive moments of leadership in the war. Rommel then instructed the 90th Light Division and the Trieste Division to eliminate the French at Bir Hakeim, allowing him to break the Gazala line from the south. On June 3rd, Koenig's forces defended against the attacking enemy. The British sent in a relief force, but it encountered the 21st Panzer Division and had to retreat. No further attempts were made to assist the French garrison, partly due to the collapse of a counterattack further north on June 5th, caused by the incompetence and lack of bravery among formation commanders who were hesitant to risk their tanks against the German 88mm guns. A few supplies reached them. The Royal Air Force provided as much support as they could, helping to disrupt attacks and fend off the Stukas and Heinkels. French colonial troops swiftly took care of any Stuka pilots who parachuted down. Koenig's men, suffering from thirst and hunger in the sweltering heat and dust, dug their foxholes deeper, preparing for a larger assault. By holding their position, they understood they were assisting the withdrawal of the Eighth Army. Frustrated by the determination of the French defense, Rommel took charge personally. On June 8th, German artillery and Stukas resumed their bombardment of the position. One bomb killed 17 wounded individuals in the dressing station. Yet the defenders' determination never wavered. One officer witnessed the sole survivor of a gun crew, a legionnaire with a hand blown off, managing to reload the 75mm gun by using his bloody stump to ram in the shell. By June 10th, the French defenses were finally breached. The defenders at Bir Hakeim ran out of ammunition. That night, the British 7th Armored Division, the only force that could have rescued them, retreated. Koenig received orders to fall back. He guided most of his remaining troops through the German encirclement under the cover of darkness. Initially, they moved undetected, but soon came under heavy fire. He was joined by his brave English driver and companion Susan Travers, who later became a warrant officer in the French Foreign Legion. Meanwhile, Rommel received an order from Adolf Hitler to execute any captured legionnaires. This included Frenchmen, anti-fascist Germans, and citizens from other occupied nations. Rommel chose to treat them as ordinary prisoners of war, which was commendable. When General Charles de Gaulle was informed by General Sir Alan Brooke that Koenig and most of his men had made it back to British lines, he felt such intense emotion that he had to seclude himself. He later documented in his memoirs, "Oh, the heart beating with emotion, sobs of pride, tears of joy." He understood this moment marked the beginning of France's revival. Further north, the Battle of the Cauldron persisted, with the British and Indian brigades valiantly defending their positions. However, the Eighth Army was still unable to launch a successful counterattack. On June 11th, immediately after the fall of Bir Hakeim, Rommel commanded his 3 German divisions to eliminate the remaining British strongholds. This included the Knightsbridge Box, held by the 201st Guards Brigade and the 4th Armored Brigade. They were to secure the Via Balbia. This led to a hasty withdrawal on June 14th, when the South Africans and the 50th Division near the coast were ordered to retreat to the Egyptian frontier to avoid encirclement. An ungraceful general retreat followed, known as the Gazala Gallop. Tobruk was left vulnerable, and the Italian infantry moved in to encircle it from the east. Rommel advanced his German divisions, but the 21st Panzer Division suffered significant losses from the attacks by Royal Air Force Hurricane and P-40 Kitty Hawk fighter bombers. Air Vice Marshal Arthur Coningham's Desert Air Force continually improved its tactics, and without their support, the Eighth Army might have faced dire consequences. Winston Churchill sent orders to General Claude Auchinleck, insisting that Tobruk must be held at all costs. Tobruk faced a shortage of troops and artillery, as many of its mines had been used to reinforce the Gazala line. On June 17th, Rommel launched his attack with a diversion on one side of the perimeter, while secretly gearing up to strike another area. The 2nd South African Division, under Major General Hendrik Klopper, lacked the experience of the Australians who had fiercely defended Tobruk the previous year. Admiral Cunningham understood that he did not have enough ships to sustain Tobruk during another siege. The garrison, numbering 33,000, included 2 additional infantry brigades and a weak armored brigade equipped with outdated tanks. At dawn on June 20th, Kesselring deployed all available Stuka and bombing groups in the Mediterranean, supported by squadrons from the Italian Air Force, the Regia Aeronautica. This was paired with an intense artillery attack, while German pioneer battalions worked to clear paths through the minefields. The 11th Indian Brigade was taken aback by the unprecedented assault. By 8:30 in the morning, the first German tanks breached the outer defenses. In just one day, as columns of smoke billowed from the devastated town, the Germans advanced to the port, splitting the 20-kilometer-long fortress position in half. It was a stunningly rapid victory. General Klopper surrendered the next morning, before the port and many supply dumps were destroyed. 4,000 tons of oil fell into Rommel's control, which was the best gift he could have imagined. His starving soldiers, their clothes tattered, were overjoyed with the spoils. One Unteroffizier wrote home, "We have chocolate, tinned milk, canned vegetables, and biscuits by the crate. We have English vehicles and weapons in abundance. What a feeling to wear English shirts and stockings." The Italian soldiers did not benefit from the rich resources. The same Unteroffizier admitted, "They have it tougher than we do, with less water, less food, lower pay, and not the same equipment." Mussolini sought to portray the capture of Tobruk as an Italian victory. To counter this, Hitler promptly elevated Rommel to the rank of General Feldmarschall. This promotion sparked jealousy and resentment among the top tiers of the Wehrmacht, which Hitler likely relished. On the first anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, the German dictator was thrilled. He believed, as he had claimed, that the British Empire was starting to crumble. In just 1 week, Operation Blue was set to launch in southern Russia to capture the Caucasus. The Third Reich appeared as strong as ever. On that June day, Winston Churchill was in the White House with Franklin Roosevelt when an aide entered and handed the president a note. Roosevelt read it and then passed it to Churchill. Churchill felt a wave of sickness and disbelief. He asked General Ismay to confirm with London whether Tobruk had really fallen. Ismay returned with the sad news. It was true. The humiliation in that moment was immense. Churchill later reflected that defeat is one thing, but disgrace is another. Roosevelt, displaying his generous nature, immediately inquired how he could assist. Churchill requested as many of the new Sherman tanks as the Americans could provide. 4 days later, the American Chiefs of Staff approved the shipment of 300 Shermans and 105mm self-propelled guns. This act demonstrated great generosity, especially since the tanks had to be taken from American Army units eager to replace their outdated vehicles. Deeply upset and stunned, Churchill returned to confront a motion of no confidence in the House of Commons. He placed most of the blame on General Auchinleck, which was likely unjust. Auchinleck's major mistake was appointing General Ritchie. The severe shortage of capable and decisive leaders at the upper echelons of the British Army significantly impacted its effectiveness. Field Marshal Brooke attributed this to the deaths of many talented young officers in the First World War. Another serious issue was the long-standing failure of the arms procurement system. Unlike the Royal Air Force, which attracted the best designers and engineers during an era of exciting aviation advancements, the Army accepted outdated armaments. It continued to mass-produce them instead of innovating. This cycle began after the significant loss of equipment at Dunkirk and the urgent need to replace weapons, but had not been disrupted. Some of the new 6-pounder anti-tank guns had performed well in the Gazala battles. However, sending poorly designed tanks with 2-pounder guns to fight against the Panzer IV, and especially the 88mm gun, was like pitting biplanes against advanced fighter planes. One must admire the courage of the crews who attacked, fully aware that their tanks were nearly useless, except against infantry. The British did not develop a truly effective tank, the Comet, until the very end of the war. Churchill's only consolation from his visit to the United States was persuading President Franklin D. Roosevelt to agree to invade French North Africa. Operation Gymnast, later renamed Operation Torch, faced strong opposition from General George Marshall and the other American military leaders. Marshall's concerns about Churchill influencing Roosevelt without any of the president's military advisors present proved to be valid. They suspected with some basis that Britain aimed to maintain its influence in the Middle East. Churchill feared that losing Egypt could allow the Germans to link an invasion through the Caucasus with Rommel's advance. This would threaten not only the Suez Canal, but also the region's oil fields. It could also encourage Japan to widen its operations into the Western Indian Ocean. Additionally, Churchill had another reason that aligned with Roosevelt's views. With an early invasion of northern France ruled out due to insufficient air superiority and a lack of shipping and landing craft, there were no other areas where American troops could engage Germany. The Prime Minister understood that Admiral Ernest King and the American public wanted to abandon the Germany First strategy and focus on the Pacific. Even General Sir Alan F. Brooke had serious doubts about the landings in North Africa, yet Churchill was ultimately proven correct, though for reasons different from those he initially presented. The United States Army needed combat experience before facing the Wehrmacht in major battles in mainland Europe. The Allies also needed to grasp the challenges of amphibious operations before attempting an invasion across the English Channel. Kesselring still aimed to conquer Malta first, but Rommel insisted he needed Luftwaffe support to destroy the Eighth Army before it could regroup. Hitler backed Rommel, believing that capturing Egypt would render Malta useless. However, they failed to recognize that while the Luftwaffe focused on assisting Rommel during the battles at Gazala, Malta received reinforcements. Once again, the supply lines across the Mediterranean faced threats. The capture of Tobruk and its port did not resolve the logistical problems of the desert campaign as Rommel had anticipated. This situation exemplified the rubber band effect of these military operations, where the stretched supply line ultimately led to disaster, pulling back the aggressor. Even before Tobruk fell, Rommel had instructed the 90th Light Division to advance towards Egypt along the coastal road. On June 23rd, he also sent in 2 panzer divisions to chase the Eighth Army. Meanwhile, Auchinleck dismissed Ritchie and took command. He wisely canceled orders to hold the line at Mersa Matruh and directed all units to quickly retreat to El Alamein, a small railway stop by the sea. He aimed to create his defensive line between El Alamein and the Karara Depression to the south, with its salt marshes and quicksands. He was confident that Rommel would not outflank his position as easily as he had at Gazala. Morale in the Eighth Army was very low. Despite Auchinleck's resolve to fall back to El Alamein, Ritchie's previous order had stationed the 10th Indian Division at Mersa Matruh. It was caught off guard by the rapid advance of Rommel's forces, which encircled the town and blocked the coastal road. A part of X Corps managed to escape, but over 7,000 men were captured in the process. Further south, the New Zealand Division struck the 21st Panzer Division in a fierce night attack. killing both wounded soldiers and medics, which the Germans deemed a war crime. Rommel remained convinced that he had the Eighth Army in retreat and could reach the Middle East. Mussolini was so confident of victory that he arrived in the port city of Derna on a grand gray stallion, ready for a triumphal parade in the Egyptian capital. In Cairo, panic and confusion spread throughout the offices of GHQ Middle East and the British Embassy, amusing or alarming many Egyptians. Long lines formed outside banks. On July 1st, smoke rose from official documents being burned in the gardens of government buildings. They scattered a whirlwind of partially burned secret documents around the city. Street vendors eagerly collected them to fashion cones for their peanuts, resulting in the day being dubbed Ash Wednesday. Members of the European community began to depart by car, with mattresses strapped to their roofs. It brought to mind the scenes in Paris from 2 years earlier. The situation, referred to as the Flap, originated in Alexandria. Vice Admiral Sir Henry Harwood, who had just succeeded Cunningham, ordered the British fleet to disperse to various ports in the Levant. Rumors circulated that the Germans would arrive within 24 hours and that an airborne invasion could happen at any moment. Egyptian shopkeepers began preparing portraits of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini to display in their shops. Some went even further. Nationalist officers, wishing for independence from British rule, started planning for an uprising. One officer, Anwar Sadat, who would later become the president of the country, purchased 10,000 empty bottles to create Molotov cocktails. For the Jewish community, the situation was deeply frightening. Although British authorities in Cairo offered them priority on trains to Palestine, the Palestine administration denied them visas. Their fears were justified. An SS Einsatzkommando unit was stationed in Athens, ready to operate in Egypt and then Palestine if Erwin Rommel's victories continued. Desertions from the British Army of the Nile, as Winston Churchill termed it, spiked dramatically. The estimated total in the city and the Delta reached 25,000 men. British officers felt compelled to make jokes in the face of calamity. They had long complained about the service at Shepherd's Hotel, quipping, "Just wait until Rommel gets to Shepherd's. That will slow him down." Rumors spread that Rommel had already called to reserve a room. German radio even sent a message to the women of Alexandria, "Get out your party dresses, we are coming." However, Axis optimism was premature. While the Germans had been intercepting British signals at a tactical level, Auchinleck was aware of Rommel's intentions through ultra-intelligence. In the early hours of July 1st, the Africa Corps, along with 2 panzer divisions, began a feint attack toward the south of the Alamein line. Rommel's true objective lay further north, yet in his eagerness to catch the Eighth Army off guard, he neglected proper reconnaissance. This was a serious mistake, worsened by a sandstorm. The 90th Light Division attempted to attack the Alamein box but was driven back by unexpectedly heavy artillery fire. Shortly after, the 21st Panzer Division moved towards a central box held by the 18th Indian Brigade. They captured the position but lost a third of their tanks, many to Royal Air Force fighter bombers. Conningham's Desert Air Force continued its unyielding assaults. His pilots were conducting sorties at an even higher pace than during the Battle of Britain. The Air Force included pilots from numerous nations, such as the Free French Groupe de Chasse Alsace, equipped with a mix of aircraft. Conyngham urgently needed Spitfires to engage the Messerschmitts, but the Air Ministry in London hesitated to release them from home defense. His Desert Air Force was now supported by an American bombing group of B-24 Liberators, attacking Axis ships in the ports of Benghazi, Tobruk, and Mersa Matruh. The United States Middle East Army Air Force was being organized under Major General Lewis H. Brereton, consisting of both fighter and bombardment groups. For the first time, British and American forces were operating together. German hopes for an easy victory started to fade. Auchinleck launched a counterattack with mobile units, effectively concentrating his artillery. The New Zealand Division also distinguished itself by timing a sudden counterattack against the Ariete Division, forcing it into disarray. Late on the night of July 3rd, Rommel commanded the Panzerarmee Africa to assume a defensive posture. They had fewer than 50 tanks that were battle-ready. His soldiers were utterly worn out and lacking ammunition and fuel. He could not afford a battle of relentless pounding. The rocky, scree-covered and sandy ground of the Alamein line was just as inhospitable for the men of the Eighth Army. They struggled with aggressive swarms of flies, sandstorms driven by the wind, and the oppressive desert heat. Tanks turned into ovens under the searing sun. At night, soldiers huddled tightly in ground sheets to ward off scorpions. They faced dysentery spread by the flies and desert sores which enticed the relentless insects. Whenever the soldiers attempted to eat their corned beef hash or hardtack biscuits turned into a porridge that resembled plaster of Paris, it was nearly impossible not to swallow a few flies along the way. The only source of comfort was a cup of tea, even if the water tasted quite unpleasant. Unsurprisingly, thoughts of home cooking and the comforts of home filled the soldiers' minds. One rifleman told his fellow soldiers that when he returned home, he planned to enjoy chocolate ice cream while sitting on the toilet and relishing the luxury of pulling the chain. The Eighth Army was too weary to launch a counterattack, so their focus shifted to reinforcing their position along the line. They brought in a new Australian brigade to the Ruwaisat Ridge. On July 10th, Rommel launched another attack. However, to the north, the 9th Australian Division, backed by an armored brigade, broke through the Italian lines near El Alamein, sending them fleeing. They captured Rommel's signals intelligence unit, which rendered him nearly blind since the Germans could no longer decode American communications. The American military attaché Bonner Fellers, who had unknowingly provided the Germans with valuable intelligence, had departed at the end of June. Throughout most of July, the two sides engaged in a back and forth of attacks and counterattacks, similar to a game of scissors, paper, stone. Rommel was furious about the performance of most Italian units, leading to intense arguments between the Axis partners. He felt compelled to reorganize some of his forces to insert corset stiffeners among certain Italian divisions. His complaints about lack of supplies again fell on deaf ears as the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy continued to inflict heavy losses on Axis convoys and port facilities. His hope that capturing Tobruk and Mersa Matruh would resolve his issues in one fell swoop was abruptly crushed. On the night of July 26th, the newly formed Special Air Service, utilizing jeeps, attacked an airfield near Fuka, destroying 37 aircraft on the ground, including many Junkers 52 transports. This brought the total for the month to 86 aircraft destroyed. Auchinleck's accomplishments should not be overlooked. He managed to save a heavily damaged Eighth Army from disaster and stabilized the front line, all while causing significant losses for the Germans. Churchill saw things quite differently. He focused on missed chances and refused to recognize the fatigue of the troops or the shocking weakness of British armored vehicles. On August 3rd, accompanied by General Sir Alan Brooke, he arrived in Cairo on his way to Moscow. His goal was to alert Stalin about the delay of the Second Front. The British thought they had successfully persuaded the Americans to abandon Operation Sledgehammer, the plan to invade the Cotentin Peninsula that was hastily promised to Molotov. However, during the second week of July, there were signs of dissent among the American military leaders and Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson. They worried that the British were secretly against any invasion of northern France. This led them to advocate for abandoning the Germany First strategy and shifting attention to the Pacific. On July 14th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, acting in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief, halted their plans. He stated that sending troops to capture small islands in the Pacific would be exactly what Germany hoped for and would not change the world situation in the immediate future. It would also not benefit Russia or the Middle East. The extent to which this was a bluff by Marshall to pressure the British into agreeing to a cross-channel invasion remains unclear. Nevertheless, later that month, Marshall and Admiral King visited Churchill at Chequers to attempt to revive Operation Sledgehammer. The British firmly opposed this idea. They believed it would be disastrous and offer no assistance to the Red Army. Harry Hopkins, who was also in London, secretly supported the British, knowing that Roosevelt wanted American troops engaged in North Africa. Marshall eventually resigned to managing what he considered an unfavorable situation in Britain's war, sent one of his top staff officers, Major General Dwight D. Eisenhower, to London. Eisenhower's mission was to start planning the landings in North Africa while also preparing to take overall command. Before finishing his trip to the Soviet Union, Churchill was determined to address the command issues in the Middle East. General Auchinleck advised him against launching another attack before mid-September. In response, Churchill decided to replace Auchinleck with General Sir Harold Alexander as Commander-in-Chief. He also appointed Lieutenant General Strafer Gott, commander of 13 Corps, to lead the 8th Army. Gott, who was one of the better desert commanders, was exhausted and demoralized by this point. Brooke preferred to appoint Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, but Churchill was firm in his decision. The matter was settled when Gott was killed after his plane was shot down by a Messerschmitt. Montgomery would indeed take command. He took pride in being different from the typical senior officer in the British Army. The short, wiry general with a prominent nose stood in stark contrast to the unassuming, aristocratic Alexander. Montgomery had a different style of dress. He favored a loose pullover and corduroy pants, later capped with a black Royal Tank Regiment beret as a signature look. Despite his informal appearance, he was a military conservative. He believed in thorough staff work and the organization of divisions rather than the casual battle groups that had emerged during the Desert Campaign. He appealed to the crowd, whether they were soldiers or journalists, despite his sharp voice and trouble pronouncing his R's. A non-smoker and teetotaler, he was egotistical, ambitious, and ruthless. His boundless self-confidence sometimes bordered on the absurd. However, this confidence helped him to inspire everyone he encountered and was crucial in his mission to transform the battered 8th Army into one that believed in victory. Commanders had to take charge, and there would be no more complaints about orders. The situation Montgomery faced in August 1942 wasn't as bleak as he later claimed. Rommel's German and Italian divisions had taken significant damage during the battles in July. However, Montgomery was right to be alarmed by the defeatist mindset of many senior staff officers, although he was mistaken to suggest that Auchinleck shared their views. Auchinleck's oversight was his lack of awareness regarding this mood among the so-called Gabardine swine, as the fighting officers referred to the staff at Headquarters Middle East in Cairo. Montgomery informed the 8th Army that he had ordered the destruction of all plans for withdrawal. With great theatrical flair, he successfully restored morale and confidence through visits and training programs. The impression of dramatic change worked wonders, even though Montgomery claimed credit for several innovations that had actually begun under Auchinleck. Montgomery had no plans to launch an early offensive, even though that caution had led to Auchinleck's removal. He was much more strategic in his approach to the Prime Minister. Montgomery intended to take longer than Auchinleck's mid-September timeline. He was committed to building up his forces to such an overwhelming level that victory would be nearly assured. This strategy was almost certainly wise, as Britain could not endure another failure. Rommel had received reinforcements, including the 164th Division and a brigade of paratroopers. However, he knew his situation was now worse than uncertain. His troops were too weak to engage in a prolonged battle against the Alamein line. Instead, he wanted to retreat to draw the British out of their positions. He aimed to force them into a battle of movement, where his panzer units would have the upper hand. He was still lacking in transport and fuel since the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy were sinking supply ships one after another. Frustrated and under stress, Rommel harshly criticized the performance of Italian forces, despite some units, like the Folgore Division, fighting effectively. In late August, the dynamics shifted. Mussolini and Kesselring urged Rommel to initiate an offensive without delay, while he had grown hesitant and pessimistic. On August 30th, feeling trapped by the situation, Rommel launched an attack on the southern section of the 8th Army line, planning to move behind and strike the Alam Halfa Ridge. He recognized that running out of fuel was his greatest risk, but Kesselring assured him that tankers were on their way and that supplies would be expedited. Montgomery, informed of Rommel's strategy through ultra-decryptions, positioned his armored units to counter the assault. Much like Auchinleck had planned, Rommel's reconnaissance and intelligence were lacking. His staff had underestimated the minefields they needed to cross in the south and failed to grasp the impact of the Desert Air Force in the upcoming battle. As Rommel's two panzer divisions struggled through the minefields, Conningham's squadrons of bombers and fighter bombers relentlessly attacked them during a night lit by flares. The panzers, clustered together in tight spaces, became relatively easy targets. The Afrika Korps and the Littorio Armored Division did not reach their destination until the next morning. Only then did the march northward towards the Alam Halfa Ridge pick up pace. Rommel felt encouraged to press on, and Kesselring deployed his Stukas to attack the defensive positions ahead. However, the slow and vulnerable Stukas suffered heavy losses from the Desert Air Force squadrons. The ridge was well fortified, which caused the panzer divisions to stop. Rommel anticipated a large counterattack on September 1st, but Montgomery was hesitant to put his armored units at risk with more cavalry charges. He kept most of them positioned, protected. Only one armored counterattack was initiated. Then Rommel received devastating news. The tankers he relied on had been attacked with catastrophic consequences. Once again, Ultra had helped the British locate them. Rommel found himself in a difficult situation. His panzer divisions were stuck in the open, caught between the Alamein line to the west and the British armor to the east and south. They faced constant assaults from the Desert Air Force. On September 5th, he ordered a withdrawal. Apart from an ineffective counterattack by the 33rd Corps in the south, Montgomery missed the chance to deliver a significant blow. However, the defeat of the Afrika Korps and the damage caused by the Desert Air Force significantly boosted the morale of the Eighth Army. Rommel managed to save most of his forces, but he understood that the tide of war in North Africa had permanently turned against him, even though he remained unaware of the threat Eisenhower was planning to his rear. As the snows melted in the spring of 1942, the grim realities of the winter fighting became evident. Soviet prisoners were forced to bury the bodies of their comrades who had fallen during the January offensive. A German soldier wrote home on a piece of paper taken from a dead commissar, saying that with the weather warming up during the day, the bodies were beginning to smell and needed to be buried. A soldier from the 88th Infantry Division noted that, following the capture of a village during a rapid thaw, around 80 bodies of German soldiers from a reconnaissance battalion emerged from under the snow. Their limbs were severed, and their skulls were crushed. Many had been burned as well. However, once the birch trees began to leaf out and the sun dried the soggy ground, the morale of the German officers experienced a remarkable boost. It felt like the harsh winter was just a bad dream, and now it was time for their victories to begin again. The panzer divisions received new equipment, reinforcements were integrated into existing units, and ammunition supplies were stockpiled for a summer offensive. The Grossdeutschland Infantry Regiment, which had suffered greatly during the winter disaster, was transformed into a motorized division, now featuring 2 panzer battalions and assault guns. The Waffen-SS divisions were upgraded into panzer formations, though many regular divisions received only basic replacements. Tensions between the SS and the Army grew. A battalion commander in the 294th Infantry Division noted in his diary the unease regarding the power and influence of the SS. He mentioned that people in Germany were already saying the army would be disarmed by the SS at the frontier after returning from victory. Many soldiers who received the Winter Campaign Medal were not impressed and mockingly called it the Order of the Frozen Flesh. By the end of January, new guidelines were issued for those on leave. They were reminded they were still under military law and subject to punishment. They were instructed not to discuss weapons, tactics, or losses, and not to mention poor rations or injustice, as the enemy's intelligence service could take advantage of it. The soldiers' cynicism grew with the late arrival of civilian winter clothing, skiing gear, and women's fur coats, which were sent in response to Goebbels' appeal for warm clothes for the soldiers on the Eastern Front. The smell of mothballs and memories of home intensified their sense of isolation, making them feel like they were stranded on a distant planet rife with filth and lice. The vastness of the Soviet Union was demoralizing. The same captain in the 294th Division described endless barren fields with hardly any woods and just a few scattered trees. He noted the sad collective farms with their ruined houses and a handful of dirty people in rags standing by the railway track with blank expressions. While Joseph Stalin believed the Wehrmacht would launch another attack on Moscow, Adolf Hitler had a different plan. Understanding that Germany's survival in the war hinged on food and fuel, he aimed to solidify his control over Ukraine and capture the oil fields in the Caucasus. Stalin would be the first to falter in this grim military conflict, while Hitler would eventually go too far, resulting in disastrous outcomes. For the time being, however, things seemed to favor the Führer. On May 7th, Manstein's 11th Army in the Crimea launched a counterattack against the Soviet forces trying to advance from the Kerch Peninsula. By sending in his tanks on the flank, he managed to surround them. Many soldiers fought valiantly, only to be trapped in their trenches by German tanks that twisted and turned to bury them in the earth. The ensuing disaster over the next 10 days, largely the responsibility of Stalin's favorite commissar, Lev Meklis, resulted in the loss of 176,000 men, 400 aircraft, 347 tanks, and 4,000 guns. Meklis attempted to blame the troops, particularly those from Azerbaijan, but the staggering losses bred deep resentment in the Caucasus. Although he was demoted, Stalin quickly found Meklis another position. According to German reports, soldiers from Central Asia were the most prone to desert. They had been poorly trained and rushed to the front lines, often claiming that the Russians forced them onward. During one night, they crossed the river and trudged through mud and water up to their knees, gazing at the Germans with desperate eyes. They felt free only in captivity. The Russians were increasingly enforcing measures to curb desertion and fleeing from the battlefield. This included the establishment of guard companies tasked solely with preventing their own units from retreating. If the situation was truly that grim, then the assessments of the demoralization of the Red Army were accurate. Another calamity, even worse than the one at Kerch, was soon to unfold. In March, Marshal Timoshenko, with the support of Nikita Khrushchev, suggested that the southwestern and southern fronts should disrupt any offensive against Moscow by launching a pincer attack on Kharkov. This plan was intended to align with a breakout from the Kerch Peninsula to support the beleaguered garrison in Sevastopol. The Stavka had little insight into German strength, mistakenly believing their forces still faced the weakened units from winter. Soviet military intelligence failed to recognize the significant reinforcement of Army Group South, even though many of these troops were Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian, all of whom were under-equipped and poorly supplied. Hitler's renewed offensive was called Fall Blau, or Operation Blue. The Germans knew that Timoshenko was preparing for an attack, but it came sooner than they anticipated. They were planning their own assault south of Kharkov to cut off the Barvenkovo salient, which the Red Army had established during their January offensive. This operation was known as Operation Fredericus and served as the build-up to Blau. On May 12th, just 5 days after a failed attempt from the Kerch Peninsula, Timoshenko launched his offensive. The southern flank of his attack broke through a weak security division and advanced 15 kilometers on the first day. Soviet soldiers were astonished by the abundance they found in the captured positions. They discovered luxuries like chocolate, tins of sardines, meat, white bread, cognac, and cigarettes. However, their own losses were severe. Yuri Vladimirov, who served in an anti-aircraft battery, described it as dreadful. He witnessed heavily injured men dying from blood loss, begging for help, and they were powerless to assist. The northern part of the offensive lacked coordination and faced continuous assaults from the Luftwaffe. A soldier from the 28th Army recounted that they advanced from Volchansk toward Kharkov and could see the chimneys of the renowned tractor plant. However, German aircraft bombarded them relentlessly from 3 in the morning until nightfall, with only a brief lunch break. The destruction was extensive. There was chaos among the commanders and a shortage of ammunition. The soldier observed that even the military tribunal had to get involved in the fighting. Timoshenko realized he had struck the Germans while they were preparing for their own offensive. However, he he did not suspect that he might be walking into a trap. General-Lieutenant Paulus, an adept staff officer with no prior command experience, was taken aback by the intensity of Timoshenko's attack on his 6th Army. 16 of his battalions suffered significant losses amidst heavy spring rains. Nevertheless, General Feldmarschall von Bock recognized a chance for a decisive victory. He convinced Hitler that Kleist's 1st Panzer Army could cut off Timoshenko's forces from the south. Hitler eagerly embraced the plan and took ownership of the idea. On May 17th, Kleist launched his attack just before dawn. Timoshenko called Moscow for reinforcements, still unaware of the perilous situation he faced. On the evening of May 20th, he managed to convince Nikita Khrushchev to call Joseph Stalin and ask for the cancellation of the offensive. Khrushchev was connected to the dacha in Kuntsevo. Stalin instructed Georgy Malenkov, the secretary of the Central Committee, to speak with him. Khrushchev insisted on talking to Stalin directly. Stalin declined this request and told Malenkov to find out Khrushchev's intentions. When Stalin learned the reason, he shouted that military orders must be obeyed and directed Malenkov to end the conversation. This moment is believed to have sparked Khrushchev's deep-seated animosity towards Stalin, which culminated in his fervent criticism of the dictator at the 20th Party Conference in 1956. It took 2 more days before Stalin agreed to call off the offensive. By that time, the majority of the 6th and 57th Soviet armies had been encircled. The trapped troops desperately tried to escape, even charging with linked arms, resulting in a horrific slaughter. Bodies piled up in waves before the German positions. The skies were clear, giving the Luftwaffe perfect visibility. A soldier in the 389th Infantry Division noted, "Our pilots work night and day in their hundreds." He described a horizon shrouded in smoke. Despite the chaos, Yuri Vladimirov managed to hear a lark singing on a hot, cloudless day. But then he heard the urgent warning of tanks! Tanks coming, and rushed to hide in a trench. The end was near. To avoid immediate execution, commissars removed their distinctive uniforms and donned those of deceased Red Army soldiers. They also shaved their heads to pass as ordinary soldiers. When surrendering, the soldiers plunged their rifles into the ground, bayonets fixed. Vladimirov wrote that it resembled a magical forest after a fire, with all the trees stripped of leaves. In his filthy, lice-infested state, he contemplated suicide, knowing what awaited him, but ultimately let himself be captured. Amid the discarded helmets and gas masks, they collected the wounded and transported them on makeshift stretchers made from rain capes. The German soldiers then marched the hungry and exhausted captives in columns, 5 men wide. Approximately 240,000 men were taken prisoner, along with 2,000 field guns and most of the tank units involved. One army commander and many officers chose to take their own lives. Kleist noted after the battle that the area was so filled with the bodies of men and horses that his command vehicle struggled to pass through. The Second Battle of Kharkov dealt a significant blow to the morale of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev and Timoshenko feared for their lives. Although they had been friends, they began to blame one another. Khrushchev seemed to suffer a nervous breakdown during this time. In true Stalin fashion, he humiliated Khrushchev. He tapped the ash from his pipe onto Khrushchev's bald head, claiming this was a Roman tradition for commanders who had lost battles. The Germans celebrated their victory, yet it had a troubling consequence. Paulus, who had initially wanted to retreat, became impressed by what he believed was Hitler's insight in commanding him to hold his position while Kleist prepared the decisive attack. He valued order and respected the chain of command. These traits, along with his newfound admiration for Hitler, would significantly impact events 6 months later at Stalingrad. Despite the grave threats to the Soviet Union's existence that year, Stalin focused on post-war borders. The Americans and British rejected his pleas to recognize the Soviet borders from June 1941, which included the Baltic states and eastern Poland. However, in the spring of 1942, Churchill reconsidered. He thought about agreeing to Stalin's claims as a way to keep him engaged in the war, even though this would violate the Atlantic Charter, which guaranteed self-determination. Both President Franklin Roosevelt and his Secretary of State, Sumner Welles, firmly rejected Churchill's proposal. Ironically, later in the war, it would be Churchill opposing Stalin's imperial ambitions, while Roosevelt would be the one to accept them. Relations between the Western Allies and Stalin were marked by deep suspicion. Churchill notably promised much more military support than Britain could actually provide. The American president's disastrous assurance to Molotov in May that a second front would be launched before the year's end poisoned the Grand Alliance more than any other issue. Stalin's paranoia convinced him that capitalist nations were merely waiting for the Soviet Union to weaken. Roosevelt, ever calculating, had told Molotov through Harry Hopkins that he supported opening a second front in 1942, but claimed his generals were against the idea. Roosevelt appeared willing to say anything to keep the Soviet Union in the war, regardless of the outcomes. When it became evident that the Allies were not planning to invade northern France that year, Stalin felt deceived. Churchill found himself facing Stalin's anger over unmet promises. Although both he and Roosevelt acted recklessly, Stalin refused to recognize any real challenges. The losses incurred by the Arctic convoys to Murmansk were not part of his considerations. The PQ convoys began sailing from Iceland to Murmansk in September 1941, confronting severe dangers. During winter, the ships would be covered in ice and the seas became hazardous. In summer, the long days left them exposed to German air attacks from bases in northern Norway, along with the ongoing threat of U-boats. In March, a quarter of the ships in PQ-13 were lost. Churchill pressured the Admiralty to send PQ-16 in May, even if it meant that only half the ships would reach their destination. He was fully aware of the political fallout of canceling it. In the end, only 6 out of 36 ships sank. The subsequent convoy, PQ-17, marked the largest shipment yet sent to the Soviet Union and became one of the most significant naval disasters of the war. Faulty intelligence indicated that the German battleship Tirpitz, along with the Admiral Hipper and Admiral Scheer, had departed Trondheim to intercept the convoy. This led the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, to issue an order to scatter the convoy on July 4th. This proved to be a disastrous choice. In total, 24 ships out of 39 were sunk by aircraft and U-boats, resulting in a loss of nearly 100,000 tons of tanks, aircraft, and vehicles. After losing Took in North Africa and witnessing the German advance into the Caucasus, the British began to fear that they might ultimately lose the war. All further summer convoys were halted, much to Stalin's displeasure. Once the Soviet forces on the Kerch Peninsula had been defeated, Manstein directed his 11th Army towards the port and fortress of Sebastopol. A vast artillery and air bombardment with Stukas failed to displace the defenders, who continued to fight from caves and tunnels deep within the rock. There were claims that the Germans used chemical weapons to dislodge them, but this remains uncertain. The Luftwaffe was resolute in countering attacks from Red Army bombers. "We are truly going to demonstrate to the Russians what playing with Germany entails," wrote an Obergefreiter. Soviet partisans harassed the German rear. One group destroyed the only railway track across the Perekop Isthmus. Anti-Soviet Crimean Tatars were enlisted to track them down. Manstein deployed a massive 800mm siege gun mounted on railway wagons to bombard the remnants of the great fortress. "This is no longer a war," a motorcycle reconnaissance soldier wrote. "It is merely the destruction of two world views." Manstein's most effective strategy involved launching a surprise attack using assault boats across Severnaya Bay. This maneuver flanked the first line of defense. The soldiers and sailors of the Black Sea Fleet continued to fight. Political officers called meetings to inform them of orders to hold their ground and die. Anti-aircraft batteries were repurposed to engage tanks, but gun after gun was destroyed. A Marine infantry member noted that the explosions merged into one continuous sound. You could no longer tell individual blasts apart. Bombing began early in the morning and persisted until late at night. Bombs and shells buried soldiers, requiring them to dig them out to continue fighting. Our telephone linesmen were all killed. Soon our last anti-aircraft gun was hit. We took position in bomb craters for infantry defense. The Germans pushed us back to the sea. We had to use a rope to get down to the cliff's base. Aware of our presence, the Germans tossed the corpses of our fallen comrades over, along with burning barrels of tar and grenades. The situation was dire. I resolved to move along the shore to Balaclava and swim across the bay at night to escape to the hills. I organized a marine infantry group, but we could only advance about a kilometer before being captured. The battle for Sebastopol raged from June 2nd until July 9th, with heavy German losses as well. I lost many comrades beside me, an Unteroffizier wrote at the end. In the heat of battle, I found myself crying for one like a child. When it was finally over, an elated Adolf Hitler promoted Manstein to Field Marshal. He envisioned Sebastopol as the primary German naval base in the Black Sea and the capital of a fully Germanized Crimea. However, as Manstein himself noted, the immense effort to capture Sebastopol significantly depleted the forces available for Operation Blau at a crucial moment. Stalin received a fortunate warning about the impending German offensive in southern Russia. However, he dismissed it as disinformation, just as he had done with intelligence regarding Operation Barbarossa the previous year. On June 19th, Major Joachim Reichel, a German staff officer carrying the plans for Operation Blue, was shot down in a Fieseler Stork plane behind Soviet lines. Despite this, Stalin believed that the main German attack would target Moscow and thought the documents were fakes. Hitler was outraged when he learned about this intelligence failure and removed both Reichel's corps and divisional commanders from their positions. Nevertheless, initial attacks to secure the starting line east of the River Donets for the first phase had already begun. On June 28th, the Second Army and Hoth's 4th Panzer Army moved eastward toward Voronezh on the Upper Don. The Stavka sent in 2 tank corps, but poor radio communications resulted in confusion, leaving them exposed and heavily damaged by Stuka attacks. Eventually, Stalin became convinced that the Germans were not advancing toward Moscow and ordered that Voronezh must be defended at all costs. Hitler then interfered with the plans for Operation Blue, which was initially set to unfold in 3 stages. The first stage aimed to capture Voronezh. The following stage would involve Paulus's 6th Army encircling Soviet forces in the Great Bend of the Don before advancing towards Stalingrad to protect the left flank. At this point, the goal was not necessarily to capture the city, but to reach it or keep it within effective range of their heavy weapons to prevent it from serving as a communications or arms hub. Only after that would the 4th Panzer move south to join Generalfeldmarschall List's Army Group A in its offensive into the Caucasus. However, Hitler's impatience led him to determine that 1 Panzer Corps was enough to secure victory at Voronezh. He ordered the rest of Hoth's Panzer Army to head south. Unfortunately, the corps that stayed at Voronezh lacked the strength to overpower the fierce defenses. The Red Army demonstrated its stubbornness in street fighting when the Germans lost their advantages in armored maneuvers and air support. Hitler ignored his generals' concerns, and at first, Operation Blue appeared to be progressing remarkably well. German armies advanced rapidly, much to the delight of the panzer commanders. During the summer heat, the ground was dry, making it easier for them to thrust southeast. A war correspondent wrote that armored vehicles and half-tracks were advancing across the steppe as far as the eye could see. Pennants waved in the warm afternoon air. One day, the temperature reached 53 degrees in the sun. Their only frustrations were a shortage of vehicles and frequent stops due to lack of fuel. To slow the German advance, Soviet aircraft dropped incendiaries at night to ignite the steppe. However, the Germans continued to push forward. Red Army tanks, camouflaged and dug in, quickly faced outflanking and destruction. Soviet infantrymen, hiding among stacks of corn, attempted to resist but were overwhelmed as the panzers crushed them beneath their tracks. Panzer troops paused in villages filled with thatched and whitewashed houses. They raided these places for eggs, milk, honey, and poultry. Anti-Bolshevik Cossacks, who had warmly welcomed the Germans, soon found their generosity exploited. An Obergefreiter wrote bitterly that they came to the local people as liberators, taking their last supplies of seed corn, vegetables, cooking oil, and more. On July 14th, Army Groups A and B met at Milarovo, but Hitler's anticipated encirclements were not happening. A new sense of realism emerged in Stavka after the Barvenkovo pocket. Soviet commanders pulled their armies back before encirclement became a reality. This adjustment prevented Hitler's plan to encircle and destroy the Soviet armies west of the River Don from succeeding. Rostov-on-Don, the entryway to the Caucasus, fell on July 23rd. Hitler immediately ordered the 17th Army to seize Batum, while the 1st and 4th Panzer armies were directed toward the oil fields of Maikop and Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. Hitler told his generals that if Maikop and Grozny were not taken, he would need to end the war. Stalin, disturbed to find that his predictions of another offensive against Moscow had failed, recognized that the Red Army did not have enough troops in the Caucasus. He sent Lavrenti Beria to instill fear among his generals. Paulus received orders to capture Stalingrad with the 6th Army, while the 4th Romanian Army was to protect his left flank along the Don. His infantry divisions had been on the move for 16 days without rest. Meanwhile, Hoth's X-14 Panzer Corps, which had sped south toward the Caucasus, was redirected to support the assault on Stalingrad. Manstein was astonished to learn that his 11th Army, after securing the Crimea, was being sent north for a new offensive on the front near Leningrad. Once again, Hitler was failing to concentrate his forces at a critical moment when he sought to capture a vast new territory. On July 28th, Joseph Stalin issued his Order Number 227, titled "Not One Step Back." This order was drafted by Colonel General Alexander Vasilevsky. It stated that panic mongers and cowards had to be eliminated immediately. The mentality of retreat must be decisively eradicated. Army commanders who allowed the voluntary abandonment of positions would face removal and immediate trial by military tribunal. Blocking groups were to be established in each army to execute those who retreated. That month, punishment battalions were bolstered with 30,000 Gulag prisoners under the age of 40, regardless of their weakness or malnutrition. In that year, 352,560 prisoners from the Gulag, about a quarter of the entire population, died. The harshness of Order Number 227 led to severe injustices as impatient generals sought scapegoats. One divisional commander ordered a colonel, whose regiment was slow in advancing, to execute someone. "This is not a trade union meeting," the general declared. "This is war." The colonel chose to execute Lieutenant Alexander Obodov, the respected commander of their mortar company. The regimental commissar and a captain from the NKVD Special Detachment arrested Obodov. "Comrade Commissar, I have always been a good man," Obodov said, unable to comprehend his fate. A friend of his later recounted how the two arresting officers became enraged and began to shoot him. Sasha tried to brush the bullets away with his arms as if they were flies. After the third volley, he fell to the ground. Even before the 6th Army under Friedrich Paulus reached the Great Bend in the River Don, Stalin established a Stalingrad front and put the city on a war footing. If the Germans crossed the Volga River, the country would be divided in two. The Anglo-American supply line through Persia was now under threat, just as the British had canceled additional convoys to northern Russia. Women and even schoolgirls were ordered to dig anti-tank ditches and berms to protect the oil storage tanks along the Volga River. The 10th NKVD Rifle Division had arrived to control the Volga crossing points and restore order to a city increasingly overtaken by panic. Stalingrad faced a grave threat from Paulus's 6th Army positioned in the Don Bend, along with Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. Hitler had unexpectedly redirected this army north to speed up the city's capture. At dawn on August 21st, infantry from the LI Corps crossed the Don using assault boats. They secured a bridgehead, and pontoon bridges were quickly constructed. The next afternoon, General Lieutenant Hans Hube's 16th Panzer Division rolled over the bridges. Just before dawn on August 23rd, Hube's leading Panzer Battalion, commanded by Oberst Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz, advanced towards the rising sun and towards Stalingrad, just 65 kilometers to the east. The Don steppe was an expanse of scorched grass, hard and unyielding. Only small gullies obstructed their rapid approach. However, Hube's headquarters suddenly halted after receiving a radio message. They waited with their engines off. Then, a Fieseler Storch aircraft appeared, circled, and landed near Hube's command vehicle. General Wolfram Freiherr von Richthofen, the fierce and shaven-headed commander of the 4th Luftflotte, approached. He informed Hube that, on orders from Führer headquarters, his entire air fleet was set to attack Stalingrad. He urged Hube to take advantage of their support, promising 1,200 aircraft for the day's operation. He could not assure more support the following day. A few hours later, German tank crews cheered as they watched squadrons of Heinkel 111s, Junkers 88s, and Stukas flying overhead towards Stalingrad. Sunday, August 23, 1942, was a day the citizens of Stalingrad would never forget. Unaware of the looming German forces, civilians picnicked under the sun on the Mamayev Kurgan, a massive Tatar burial mound in the city centered along the west bank of the Volga. Loudspeakers blared air raid warnings, but only when anti-aircraft guns began firing did people scramble for safety. Richthofen's aircraft commenced their carpet bombing of the city in waves. In his diary, he noted, "In the late afternoon, my 2-day major assault on Stalingrad began with significant incendiary effects right from the start. Petroleum storage tanks were targeted, igniting fireballs that created towering columns of black smoke visible from over 150 kilometers away. 1,000 tons of bombs and incendiaries transformed the city into a raging inferno. The once proud tall apartment buildings were reduced to ruins. It was the most intense air attack of the entire Eastern campaign. With the number of refugees increasing the population to about 600,000, around 40,000 people are thought to have lost their lives in the first 2 days due to airstrikes." Hube's 16th Panzer Division cheered for the returning aircraft, and the Stukas responded with their sirens. By late afternoon, Strachwitz's Panzer Battalion was nearing the Volga River just north of the city. Suddenly, they came under fire from anti-aircraft batteries, with their 37mm guns aimed downward. The young women operating those guns, many of them students, continued to fight until they were all killed. The panzer commanders felt shaken and uneasy upon realizing the defenders were women. The Germans had advanced from the Don to the Volga in a single day, a remarkable feat in their eyes. They believed they had reached the edge of Asia, as well as Hitler's primary goal, the Arkhangelsk-Astrakhan line. Many concluded that the war was nearly over. They took celebratory photographs of one another on their tanks and captured images of smoke rising from Stalingrad. A Luftwaffe fighter ace and his wingman, spotting the panzers below, performed victory rolls. One commander stood atop his tank on the elevated western bank of the Volga and looked across the river through his binoculars. He recalled, "We gazed at the vast steppe leading to Asia, and I felt overwhelmed. But I couldn't dwell on that for long, because we needed to launch an attack against another anti-aircraft battery that had begun firing at us." The bravery of the young women became legendary. "This was the first page of the Stalingrad defense," wrote Vasily Grossman, who received first-hand accounts shortly after. That summer, during a moment of crisis for the Grand Alliance, Winston Churchill decided he needed to meet Joseph Stalin in person. He wanted to explain the reasons for the halt of convoys and why opening a second front was not feasible at that time. He faced significant criticism in Britain following the fall of Tobruk and heavy losses in the Battle of the Atlantic. Thus, Churchill was not in the most favorable state of mind for a series of exhausting meetings with Stalin. He traveled from Cairo to Tehran and then to Moscow, arriving on August 12th. Stalin's interpreter noted Churchill inspecting the guard of honor with his chin held high, seeming to assess the determination of the Soviet soldiers. It was the first time this strong opponent of Bolshevism had visited their territory. He was joined by Averell Harriman, who represented President Roosevelt at the discussions. However, he had to enter the first car alone with the serious Molotov. That evening, Churchill and Harriman were taken to Stalin's somber apartment in the Kremlin. The British Prime Minister inquired about the military situation. This allowed Stalin to take control of the conversation. He accurately described the very risky developments in the South right before Churchill had to explain why the Second Front was delayed. Churchill started by outlining the large buildup of forces in the United Kingdom. He then talked about the strategic bombing offensive, including the significant raids on Lubeck and Cologne, knowing that these would appeal to Stalin's desire for revenge. Churchill tried to persuade him that the German forces in France were too strong to launch a cross-channel operation before 1943. Stalin strongly objected and disputed the numbers Churchill had mentioned regarding the size of the German forces in Western Europe. He contemptuously remarked that someone not willing to take risks could never win a war. To divert Stalin's anger, Churchill then laid out plans for landings in North Africa, which he was trying to get Roosevelt to approve over General Marshall's objections. He grabbed a piece of paper and drew a crocodile to illustrate his idea of attacking the soft underbelly of the enemy. However, Stalin was not satisfied with this alternative to a second front. When Churchill brought up the possibility of invading the Balkans, Stalin immediately sensed that Churchill's true aim was to preempt their occupation by the Red Army. Still, the meeting ended on a more positive note than Churchill had anticipated. However, the following day, the Soviet dictator's harsh criticism of Allied treachery, along with Molotov's firm repetition of his accusations, frustrated and upset Churchill to the point that Harriman needed to spend several hours trying to uplift his spirits. On August 14th, Churchill considered ending the talks and skipping the banquet that had been prepared in his honor that evening. The British ambassador, Sir Archibald Clark Kerr, a charming eccentric, managed to persuade him otherwise. Still, Churchill insisted on attending in his siren suit, a type of overall that Clark Kerr likened to a child's romper, while all the Soviet officials and generals were dressed in their formal uniforms. The dinner at the Grand Catherine Hall stretched beyond midnight, featuring 19 courses and a continuous flow of toasts. Most of these toasts were initiated by Joseph Stalin, who made the rounds to clink glasses. General Sir Alan Brooke noted in his diary that Stalin had an uncomfortably cold, cunning, and lifeless expression. Looking at him, he imagined Stalin could send people to their deaths without a flicker of emotion. Yet, Brooke acknowledged that Stalin possessed a sharp mind and a true understanding of the key aspects of warfare. The following day, Clark Kerr had to once again rely on all his charm and persuasive skills. Winston Churchill was outraged by Soviet allegations of British cowardice. However, after their meeting, Stalin invited him back to his office for supper. The mood quickly shifted, lightened by alcohol and the presence of Stalin's daughter, Svetlana. Stalin grew more amiable, sharing jokes with Churchill, who suddenly began to see the Soviet leader in a different light. He convinced himself that he had gained a friend in Stalin and departed Moscow the next day, filled with joy over his perceived success. Churchill, whose feelings often overshadowed reality, failed to recognize that Stalin was even more adept than Franklin D. Roosevelt at manipulating others. At home, more bad news awaited Churchill. On August 19th, combined operations, led by Lord Louis Mountbatten, launched a significant raid on Dieppe on France's northern coast. Operation Jubilee involved just over 6,000 troops, mainly Canadian forces, along with some Free French fighters and a United States Ranger battalion. Early in the operation, the Eastern Assault Force encountered a German convoy, alerting the Wehrmacht to the impending attack. A destroyer and 33 landing crafts were lost. All the tanks that had been deployed were destroyed, leaving the Canadian infantry trapped on the beach by formidable defenses and barbed wire. The raid resulted in over 4,000 casualties and yielded harsh but clear lessons. It convinced the Allies that captured ports could not be taken from the sea. Any landings would need to be preceded by extensive aerial and naval bombardment. Most importantly, they recognized that an invasion of northern France should not occur before 1944. Stalin would once again be furious about the delay of what he considered the only true second front. Yet the failure did provide one significant advantage. Hitler was convinced that his Atlantic Wall was nearly impossible to breach. He believed his forces stationed in France could easily fend off any invasion. In the Soviet Union, the news of the Dieppe raid sparked hopes that it marked the beginning of the Second Front. However, this optimism quickly turned to bitter disappointment. Many saw the operation as nothing more than a feeble concession to foreign expectations. The idea of the Second Front became a tool in Soviet propaganda. It served as both a beacon of hope for the general population and a means to shame the British and Americans. Soldiers of the Red Army were more skeptical. When they opened tins of American Lend-Lease spam, which they referred to as tushonka or stewed meat, they would jokingly say, "Let's open the second front." In contrast to their comrades in southern Russia, the morale of German troops around Leningrad was low. They were frustrated by their inability to crush the first city of Bolshevism. The bitter winter had given way to the discomforts of marshes and swarms of mosquitoes. Meanwhile, Soviet defenders were grateful to have survived the famine during that brutal winter, which had claimed nearly 1 million lives. Major efforts were made to clean the city and remove the accumulated filth that threatened to cause an epidemic. The local population was mobilized to plant cabbages on every available patch of land, including the entire Champ de Mars. The Leningrad Soviet reported that 12,500 hectares of vegetables had been planted in and around the city by the spring of 1942. To avoid another famine next winter, the evacuation of civilians resumed across Lake Ladoga, with over 500,000 people leaving the city, while troop reinforcements took their place. Other preparations included stockpiling supplies and laying a fuel pipeline across the bottom of Lake Ladoga. On August 9th, in a significant boost to morale, Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, known as the Leningrad Symphony, was played in the city and broadcast worldwide. German artillery tried to disrupt the performance, but Soviet counter-battery fire made their efforts insignificant, bringing joy to the people of Leningrad. They also found comfort in the fact that relentless Luftwaffe attacks on shipping across Lake Ladoga were diminished by the destruction of 160 German aircraft. Soviet intelligence was aware that the Germans, led by General Feldmarschall von Manstein and his newly arrived 11th Army, were preparing to launch a major assault. In an operation called Nordlicht, Adolf Hitler instructed Manstein to capture the city and connect with the Finnish forces. To counter this offensive, Joseph Stalin directed the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts to attempt once more to eliminate the German foothold that extended to the southern edge of Lake Ladoga and thereby lift the siege. This operation was known as the Signavino Offensive and began on August 19th. A young soldier from the Red Army captured his experience of a dawn attack in a letter home. He wrote about the air filled with a deafening roar of shrapnel, the trembling ground, and smoke consuming the battlefield. They pressed on without pause. It was forward only, as anything else meant death. Shrapnel struck his lip, blood spilled across his face, and fragments rained down like hail, burning his hands. Their machine gun was already firing, and the intensity increased, rendering it impossible to raise their heads. A shallow trench offered them some cover from the shrapnel. They rushed to advance and escape the firing zone. Aircraft began to buzz overhead, and bombing commenced. The soldier could not recall how long that nightmare continued. Word spread that German armored vehicles had arrived. Panic set in, but those vehicles were actually their own tanks clearing the barbed wire. Upon reaching the wire, they were met with a horrifying barrage of fire. There he saw a dead soldier for the first time, his body headless in the ditch blocking their path. It finally dawned on him that he too could be killed. They leaped over the lifeless body. They left the raging inferno behind and faced an anti-tank trench. From somewhere, submachine guns rattled. They ran, hunched over. Several explosions erupted. "Hurry up, they are throwing grenades," shouted Puchkov. They raced even faster. 2 dead machine gunners were sprawled against a log, as if struggling to crawl over it, obstructing their path. They exited the trench, crossed open ground, and jumped into another trench. A dead German officer lay at the bottom, his face buried in the mud. It was quiet here. He would never forget this long, earthen tunnel illuminated by sunlight. Bullets whizzed around them. They had no idea where the Germans were, as they seemed to be positioned both behind and ahead. One of the machine gunners stood to look but was instantly shot by a sniper. He slumped back down, as if lost in contemplation, his head drooping to his chest. Soviet losses were severe, with 114,000 casualties, including 40,000 who died. This preemptive strike infuriated Hitler as it completely derailed Manstein's operation. Despite the fewer prisoners taken than anticipated, Hitler remained fixated on the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city named after Stalin. He believed that the Russians were done for. Now settled in his new headquarters, codenamed Werewolf, Located outside Vinnytsia in Ukraine, Hitler was plagued by flies and mosquitoes. The oppressive heat made him increasingly restless. He began focusing on symbols of victory instead of actual military success. On August 12th, he mentioned to the Italian ambassador that the Battle of Stalingrad would determine the war's outcome. By August 21st, German mountain troops had climbed the 5,600-meter-high Mount Elbrus, the tallest mountain in the Caucasus, to hoist the Reich's battle flag. 3 days later, news that Paulus's panzer vanguard had reached the Volga lifted the Führer's spirits even more. However, on August 31st, he was infuriated when General Feldmarschall List, the commander-in-chief of Army Group A in the Caucasus, informed him that his troops were exhausted and facing stronger resistance than anticipated. Disbelieving List, he commanded an attack on Astrakhan and aimed to seize the western coast of the Caspian Sea. He stubbornly refused to accept that his forces were insufficient for the mission and lacked fuel, ammunition, and supplies. Meanwhile, German soldiers in Stalingrad remained optimistic. They believed they would soon capture the city and return home. A soldier in the 389th Infantry Division wrote, "Anyway, we will not be taking up winter quarters in Russia, as our division has rejected any winter clothing. We should, God willing, see you dear ones again this year." A motorcycle reconnaissance Gefreiter with the 16th Panzer Division casually remarked that he hoped the operation would not take too long, adding that the Soviet women soldiers they captured were so unattractive it was hard to look at their faces. 6th Army headquarters grew increasingly worried about their lengthy supply lines, which stretched back over the River Don for hundreds of kilometers. Richthofen noted in his diary that the nights had suddenly become very cool. Winter was approaching. Staff officers were worried about the weak Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies stationed on the right bank of the Don behind them. Red Army counterattacks had pushed these forces back in several locations. This allowed them to seize bridgeheads across the river, which would be crucial later on. Soviet intelligence officers were gathering as much information as possible about these allies of the Nazis. Many Italian soldiers were sent to the front against their will, with some even brought in chains. The Soviets learned that Romanian soldiers had been promised land in Transylvania and Ukraine by their officers after the war. However, they received a miserable salary of only 60 lei per month, and their rations consisted of just half a mess tin of hot food each day and 300 to 400 grams of bread. They deeply resented the members of the Iron Guard within their ranks, who acted as informants. The demoralization of the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies was noted carefully in Moscow. The fates of the fronts at Stalingrad, in the Caucasus, and in Egypt were closely tied together. The Wehrmacht was overextended and too dependent on weak allies. This situation meant they were doomed to lose their advantage in a war of movement. That phase was over, as the Germans had finally lost the initiative. Führer headquarters, similar to Rommel's position in North Africa, could no longer expect miracles from exhausted troops and unsustainable supply lines. Hitler had started to suspect that the high point of the Third Reich's expansion had been reached. This made him even more determined to prevent any of his generals from pulling back.